Hey all, it's Ryder, and I hope you're taking some time to reflect on what's truly important to you. Players are getting one shot all the time, and PvP can feel especially frustrating this patch. For a majority of players, the time to kill in PvP has greatly shortened, and dying in BGs happens to better players more frequently, as almost anyone can unleash a hard-hitting combo in a single game tick. There's only so much a player can do to survive against such high damage. I see many players scrambling to different options, while others hold on to staple sets like Rallying Cry, in fear of straying from the meta. Fortunately, if we examine how these sets help you survive and place that against popular subclassing builds, we can understand when a build is squishy and when it is tanky. The video will cover historical survivability strategies, how those have changed in Update 46, and what I think to be the best source of living is, that being effective maximum hit points. To begin, let's start with ESO's PvP history. For many years, Pariah and other armor increasing sets were seen as the first and only option to many players. But with the introduction of mythics and other PvP sets, as well as the now present critical damage meta, these options are less desirable. As I've talked about this extensively in my previous video, I'm not going to cover these points again. But essentially, because almost everyone is running critical damage, Rallying Cry beats out Pariah. If, however, we see a meta shift and people stray from critical damage, Pariah will be better, and I predict this will happen, but more on that soon. In updates prior to subclassing, the time to kill was higher. For those unfamiliar with the term, this refers to the duration of time required for one enemy to kill another. You can think about a fast time to kill game like Call of Duty, and an example of the opposite degree to be like two perma-blocking tanks heavy attacking each other. Because the TTK was longer, healing was more effective, but more specifically, healing over time. Because burst is so high, healing over time abilities alone cannot prevent your death as it could in previous patches. If your hit points are, let's say, 20,000, and you are dealt a 21,000 hit, even if you had 100,000 healing per second, you're still going to die. This is the reason sets like his sap, of which I used to love, fell out of favor as player damage continued to increase. This isn't to say abilities and sets that offer HOTS are useless, but we'll cover their utility later in the video. Most published and useful builds found online utilize this whether it is explicitly stated or not, and that's why you'll find most players running Rallying Cry on their build to negate the fatal damage, that being a few large critical hits in succession. When creating your build, even if you're watching this video in the far future, you must consider what the damage meta is and if the time to kill is shorter or longer previous to what you had last experienced. On your screen, I provided two graphs to show how damage is dealt. The left graph displays my damage taken by a dot build, and the right graph is damage taken from a burst setup. The dot build makes us take steady but non-lethal damage over a long period of time and is supported by bursts when our HP is low enough to try to secure the kill. In this case, healing over time is more impactful here as, like I mentioned in a previous video, dots are only effective if they surpass the healing supplied by their opponent. In addition to this, higher armor values would lower the mean of the graph and make the time to kill longer. The graph on the right displays damage with higher amplitudes as our damage taken rises dramatically before quickly falling off. Because the damage is only dealt in small windows, healing over time isn't as effective as you'd be closer to maximum hit points for most of the time, and as you cannot heal beyond your maximum HP, does not contribute to surviving a one-shot combo. I'll note that most players cannot accurately line up their burst to be done in a single game tick, and that most bursts are actually fragmented over the course of a few seconds. That said, the advice I provide is given under the context of fighting against competent, skilled players, and in this case, those who can time all their bursts to activate simultaneously. The difference between how dot damage and burst damage is displayed over time can be summarized by Wheat saying this. As another note, if you're running open world against many enemies, HOTS are especially useful to relieve pressure when you're fleeing, so don't use these examples as a black and white truth. Instead, use this information, like all the information I provide, as a guidance so that you can make the best choices for your build and playstyle. If you're watching this video during a period where dot builds are common, invest more into healing over time. If you're watching this during a period where bursts hit hard, look into ways of increasing your maximum effective hit points. Interestingly enough, many of you have reached out to me through one of the many avenues to provide your PvP experience. I don't have the exact number, but quite a large percentage are actually planning to run the counter meta of Malakath and Dots, which is great to hear so many of you going against the grain. And this next point is specifically for those of you who shared this with me. We started subclassing with many players picking up Restoring Light as their defensive line, but outside of Stormhaven dueling and the occasional player in Cyrodiil, I'm seeing many more people utilize Stormcalling instead. While many of us speculated the power behind cleanses, I'm not sure many builds are utilizing setups requiring cleanses, dueling excluded. Because players aren't running Focus Rune and Extended Ritual as often, and instead opting for Hurricane and Critical Surge, the counter meta grew just a bit stronger within recent days, and the lack of accounting for healing over time can actually play into your favor if you exploit this. To put it simply, players recognize healing over time isn't as useful, so they don't use it as much, but this actually makes them weaker against dot builds. Also somewhat unrelated, I've put my forecast of the meta's evolution on screen. These are just my predictions based on the data and observations I've collected. Regardless of if these come true or not, I recommend that you try to make your own predictions of how players will respond to the shifting tides of PvP. If you can stay ahead of how players are adapting, your build will almost always be better than most. In fact, if you're comfortable doing this, it's easy to spot if a build is running on outdated information or not, based on a forecast like this, as well as understanding the current dynamics. Back to the main topic. Now that we have some distant and recent history to continue from, we can understand what survivability and subclassing looks like. In my previous point, I noted how healing over time is less effective, but this isn't the full picture. If you've played against any unkillable healers, you've probably noticed that their HP is really high and mitigations are stacked well above 30,000. This is because they're increasing their effective maximum hit points to be as high as possible. Maximum effective hit points is a term I'll be using throughout the video, and I'll define this as a sum of your hit points, mitigations, damage shields, and temporary maneuvers that increase the amount of damage you can take before your hit points hit 0. Without going deep into the math, if you have 50% damage reduction and you have 40,000 hit points, you can equate this to 60,000 effective hit points. The math gets a bit messier than that, but for the simplicity of explaining the primary concept, we're going to discuss it in that way. Previously, 30,000 hit points was considered to be the ideal health threshold for most generalist builds. With burst being lower, some players even chose to go as low as 28,000 health, as they're more comfortable trading survivability for damage. Now, however, I recommend investing heavier into health more than before, as burst combinations have never been more deadly. While my opinion will most likely change as the meta evolves, I currently run around 35,000 hit points, and I recommend most players reach this threshold. It isn't required by any means, and some of my friends run lower and perform very well, but you may find this helpful as you navigate PvP. Hit points alone aren't enough and require mitigations to protect them. 30,000 armor seems to be working okay, but anything higher requires a deeper investment into survivability at a decent trade-off of damage. There's far too many ways to account for this with subclassing, but if you want to invest heavier into armor, consider dropping a defensive line like Restoring Light and run Stormcalling instead. This will let you use champion points that increase your base mitigations. The higher your armor, the higher your effective maximum hit points are, thus the more bursts you can survive. In fact, if your maximum effective hit points is high enough, you'll find yourself unkillable in most 1v1s unless you explicitly fumble and leave yourself open. To prevent this, watch the video of how to defend yourself. Champion points are a topic I usually avoid discussing as they're easily swapped in and out and vary completely not only from build to build but also person to person. That said, I can generally advise players to run more defensive blue CP than previous patches. Because damage potential is so high, players might find themselves not needing Mastered Arms and can secure kills just fine without it, raising the value of its counterpart, Ironclad. The flat mitigations granted by champion points are relatively strong and become even stronger as the time to kill decreases, just as it has in Update 46. After all, you can't win a fight if you're dead. The combination that works best has too many variables to offer one general recommendation, but if you're wanting some form of guidance, Ironclad and Resilient are good options, whereas focused mending could be useful if your mitigations are already really high. I've separately discussed mitigations and healing over time, but these factors aren't divided parts that make up your effective maximum hit points, but rather are tied together. If your damage taken is mitigated from, let's say, 5k DPS to 3k DPS, then the amount of healing needed to essentially negate incoming damage is much lower. An ability that demonstrates this perfectly is Living Dark, a Templar ability from Dawn's Wrath. The ability states that it heals you an amount when attacked with direct damage. Let's assume an incoming ability will deal 5,000 damage, your armor will prevent 2,000 damage, and the ability will heal you for 1,000. At the end of the calculation, assuming the 5,000 damage wouldn't kill you, the sum of the Living Dark and your armor will reduce this down to 2,000 damage. The ability is decent, but in this case only acts as a small defensive buffer to reduce damage. We can increase the effectiveness of this healing by also increasing our armor. Let's add enough armor to reduce this damage taken by another 2,000. On your screen, this scenario neutralizes the damage taken so long as Living Dark is active. This displays the idea of how healing and mitigations are actually connected, and this is an idea furthered if we invest more into defensives. Let's look at one more case where we put more points into survivability when we use Living Dark. By increasing our armor value one more time, we've reached a tipping point where Living Dark not only prevents damage, but now actually heals us when we're hit. We've reached a point where our effective maximum hit points are so high that as long as Living Dark is active, we won't have to fear death. While this is obviously just a hypothetical in a vacuum, understanding how healing and mitigations are actually paired is a crucial foundation of PvP that many players seem to overlook. The concept applies to other healing abilities as well, and when you're creating your build, remember this example as a way of understanding how healing and mitigations are actually tied together. If you find that you're healing to be strong but you die to bursts, you're lacking mitigations. And if your resistances are high but you can't keep up, your healing is too low. Another way of increasing maximum effective hit points is through damage shields. While I don't think abilities such as Hardened Ward are nearly as useful as they once were, we need to understand their value. Damage shields grant temporary hit points, thus increasing the amount of damage one can take within a small window. Because we're in a time where most players deal their damage within a second, well-timed shields are an easy way of surviving against these bursts. For personal damage shields like Hardened Ward, however, they're not the best at keeping you alive. Their best use is when your HP is high to increase the likelihood of surviving against a burst, and remains useful if your HP is in an okay spot, but you want to heal using healing over time abilities. This shield, in my opinion, is least useful when your hit points are in execute range, as they still leave you susceptible to execute abilities. Damage shields shine most now in group settings. In previous patches, healers used a lot of healing over time abilities to keep their group topped off. With the release of scribing, we noticed some groups running contingency and soul burst as shields for their group, though this wasn't entirely common, nor were these builds centered on these abilities. Now, however, the group dynamics drastically changed. As I mentioned, shields are most useful when you're at high hit points, and raise the amount of damage you can take in a short window, but another crucial point most players overlook is how they scale. On your screen, look at the damage shields and notice how they scale with maximum hit points. This means that the damage shield you apply to allies scales from your hit points, not theirs. If you're planning on making a healer but find that you can't keep your hots up with the burst, instead invest into raising your team's maximum effective hit points and try running the damage shields and stacking your own hit points as high as you can. My friend Burner demonstrated this point within his recommendation. He runs Plague Doctor, the Lord Mundus, Fet, and the Bone Goliath ultimate to increase his maximum HP greatly. I'm trying to get him to make a video on this, but he refuses. In case he does, I don't want to spoil too much. Essentially, he's using Bone Goliath to increase his maximum hit points, thus greatly increasing the output of damage shields to his allies. Boiling these concepts down, the personal shields aren't strong enough, but those placed by your group members can allow your teams to survive high bursts. Specializing into damage shields can be worth the investment if you're planning on playing support for your team. To summarize this video, in such a high burst environment, you'll want to increase your effective maximum hit points rather than investing into lots of healing over time abilities. The best way to do this is to increase your health higher than before. Invest more into armor and other mitigations, and revise your build continually as players discover more options. As with any advice I give, it's up to you to monitor the meta and assess how the waves of player choices change and to adapt to them. If we enter a period where burst is lessened or dot builds rise in popularity, you can drop your maximum effective hit points and instead invest heavier into healing over time. Some general values I'd recommend is 35,000 hit points, at least 30,000 armor, and incorporate maneuverability options like blocking or streaking away. Those values will change from one person to the next, but if you're new or are struggling in PvP within subclassing, go for higher defensives. Thank you for watching, and remember to reflect on your values.